My name is Christian from France, and my co-chair is Tarzia from Brazil, and we will have the honor to chair this initial morning session of this celebrating the centenary of the birth of Ernest Mandel and Livio Maitan, who was born in April 1923, and Ernest Mandel died in 1995, and Livio Maitan died in 2004. And for our current, the Fourth International, both played a huge role as leaders, and for many years they worked together as leaders of the Fourth International, and both produced vast quantities of analysis of the world in which we live from a Marxist, from a revolutionary Marxist point of view. And so there's much to be said in terms of their work and the lessons that we can draw from them. As I'm sure you've seen, we have three general introductory remarks for an hour from 9:30 to 10:30 Amsterdam time, and then we'll begin with roundtables on different different dimensions of the work of Ernest Mandel and Livio Maitan. I wanted to say that some 15 events have been planned or have already taken place around the world, in Argentina, Belgium, France, Britain, Italy, and I'm no doubt forgetting some of the events that have already taken place on the occasion of the centenary of these of Ernest Mandel and Livio Maitan. It's an opportunity to share thinking regarding the contributions of Ernest Mandel and Livio Maitan and their role as leaders of the Fourth International. I'll now give the floor to Éric Toussaint, who will be kicking off the introductory component of our event. Good morning to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, whether you're here on site or if you're online. I'd like to summarize a few points that might help us describe the work of Ernest Mandel, the work, lives and work of Ernest Mandel and Livio Maitan. This is what I came up with. Others can add. Both were dedicated to the building of an international revolutionary organization all throughout their lives, throughout their political lives, and right up until the end of their lives. They combined the building of a world revolutionary organization with building work in each of their own countries, whether we're talking about Ernest Mandel in Belgium or Livio Maitan in Italy. They also had an impact of the working class movement and revolutionary movement in each of their countries. Secondly, these comrades combined their theoretical analytical work with practical hands-on work. Thirdly, both Ernest and Livio traveled the world. The number of countries and organizations that they visited, the number of meetings, the number of lectures, the number of public events that they attend is too many to count. They also always sought out the unity of revolutionary currents, those of a Trotskyist background, but not only of a Trotskyist background. This quest for the unity of revolutionaries is really quite impressive, and it started from the beginning of the 1950s and went and lasted until the end of their lives. It's really amazing to see the effort they put into this, the number of meetings that they attended with this aim in sight. The other thing that united them was their approach in relation to other political currents. It was not straightforward at all that an organization like the Yugoslav League of Communists or Communist League, which had a Stalinist background. It was didn't go without saying that it had a revolutionary character, and so nor was it so straightforward to consider that the Chinese Communist Party was an organization that had in fact led a revolution, and many currents describe them as being a petty bourgeois or and peasant organizations with respect to the Chinese Communist Party, but also to recognize the Castrism and Castroism and Guevarism as a revolutionary current did not go without saying at the time, and both Livio and Ernest had a similar approach to these different currents. Both also played a key role within the leadership bodies of the Fourth International and in the other organizations where they played a role. Ernest Mandel in Belgium and Livio Maitan in Italy, both had a very collective approach to work. Perseverance, of course, revolutionary optimism, and a refusal of luxury, uh, of comfort. They lived in very modest circumstances, even though they surely could have had a much more comfortable, luxurious lifestyle, as it were, than the one they chose. I, I'm not sure how much time I have left. I think I've been speaking for 3 or 4 minutes. So I don't have much time in any case. And in the time remaining, I'd like to provide a chronology. And I know I'm not going to get to the end, so I'll wrap up when I'm told to do so. Uh, Ernest Mandel joined the FI at the age of 16 in 1939. He was arrested at the end of 1942 in Brussels as a resistor, because he was contributing to a Dutch or Flemish language journal calling on Jews to resist the Nazi occupation forces, and he was a militant, an activist of the Fourth International Group. He also met with German members of the Fourth International. He did work in relation to the German soldiers that were in the occupation army in Belgium. He was released. The circumstances of his escape can be read in the William Stuck's excellent book. Unfortunately, he was unable to join us today for health reasons. Perhaps he's following us online. He, in February 1944, he attended the first European conference of the Fourth International, which was held underground, a clandestine meeting in the Beauvais region. This is where he met Michel Raptis Pablo. He was delegated by the Belgian section, along with Abraham Leon, who sadly was murdered, was executed by the Nazis in 1944. In March 1944, he was arrested in Liège while handing out leaflets to German workers in the steel sector. He was arrested by the German army rather than by the Gestapo, fortunately, and he was sentenced to forced labor in Germany. And as he said in an interview to Tariq Ali, whereas there was a 99% chance that he would be murdered there. He was over he was extremely enthusiastic about going to Germany because he said, "I'm going to the heart of the European Revolution, because a revolution will break out in Germany, and I'll be there for it." He had just turned 21 when he was transferred to Germany. He was able to escape from the camps. He was at six different camps in Germany, and he was released in April 1945 by the American Army. In 1946, he participated in the first European Conference that followed the World War. He went to Paris, and he observed that conference participants were 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 jailed for 1 week by the French authorities. And from 1946 on, Ernest became one of the key leaders of the Fourth International. At this 1946 conference, not only were there Europeans in attendance, but also leaders from the USSWP. Cooperation between Ernest Mandel and Michel Raptus, also known as Pablo, became very close from that time on, as well as with Pierre Frank. And to as for Livio, he joined the FI in 1948. Right away, he met Ernest Mandel at a conference in Paris, and during a trip Ernest had made to Italy, and from that time on, they became a very close collaboration or cooperation, and of course, it lasted until Ernest's death in July 1995, and so almost 50 years of very close collaboration between Ernest and Livio. As for the political evolution of the leadership, of which they were members, after some hesitation, the FI leadership recognized the Yugoslav revolution as an authentic revolutionary process, as well as the Chinese Revolution. For Mandel, the League of Yugoslav Communists or the Chinese Communist Party were not strictly speaking Stalinist organizations. This differentiated his approach from others, such as Pablo, whereas the FI leadership had expected revolutionary victories in Western Europe. The leadership took note of the fact that this had not, in fact, happened, and the main organizations of the working class movement, especially social democracy and the CPs, in fact, had consolidated and strengthened their position. And so they adopted an entryist approach in a series of countries. This orientation was adopted by Pablo, Mandel, Pierre Frank, Livio, James P. Cannon from the US SWP leadership. And the decision was to practice entry either into social democracy or into CP in Britain, Japan, Belgium, France, Italy. That being said, this orientation was not implemented, and this was also part of the leadership decision. This was not applied in Sri Lanka, India, USA, Bolivia, and other Latin American countries. From the end of the Second World War until 1953, there was a common or collective leadership between the US SWP leadership, the the Trots, the U.S. Trotskyist organization from the founding of the FI, and so with the European leaders. But then in 1953 there was a split with the between the US SWP and the Europeans. Entryism had in fact created a crisis within the French section as well. I don't have time to get into the details of that. The US SWP decided to break with the Europeans, criticizing Pablo especially, describing him as a liquidationist, someone who wanted to liquidate the FI, and even insinuating that he was a Stalinist agent. At the very same time, Jerry Healy in Britain left the Fourth International, as well as Nahuel Moreno in Argentina, and they create their own respective, or rather their organizations with the USSW create the International Committee, which was in operation from with ups and downs from 1953 until 1963. For 10 years then, Ernest Mandel, Livio, Pierre Frank, and other Europeans, George Junklas from the German leadership, will do everything in their power to reunify these forces. Ernest Mandel maintained a systematic correspondence with U.S. leaders, sending out signals to encourage reunification, and this led to a unification process from 1961 onwards, and a reunification Congress, which took place in 1963. So this crowned the huge efforts that Ernest and others had put into this. At the time of the reunification, a split had taken place with the current led by Posadas, and at the time of unification, the Nahuel Moreno current did not rejoin. They joined 1 year later in 1964. The problems that arose on many occasions between Livio, Ernest, and Pierre Frank, this kind of triumvirate or trio, between those three on the one hand and Pablo on the other, saw a number of tensions. And they grew over time. Pablo felt there were no prospects for revolution in Europe from the end of 1950s onward, and therefore the FI should focus all their efforts on the colonial revolution, giving full-throated support to the colonial revolution. This didn't stop the FI from working. Pablo was building his own faction, and Ernest, Pierre, and Livio, on the other hand, all of them worked in support of the Algerian Revolution, all four of them. So this didn't prevent them from doing that. They helped produce a clandestine journal for the FLN in French and German. They transferred cadres from the FLN from one country to another to protect them, to also send funds to manufacture weapons, with the putting together of a small factory in Morocco. They even produced counterfeit currency, and Pablo and Santen from the Dutch organization were actually arrested and sentenced by the German and Dutch police. During Pablo's imprisonment, a World Congress was held in January 1961 in Düsseldorf, at the time of a huge general strike in Belgium, with more than 1 million workers on strike over 6 weeks. And Ernest Mandel is spending time in Belgium, where he was the editor-in-chief of a weekly newspaper, and where the left was producing millions of copies of La Gauche, the section's publication, during the strike, and at the same time going to the World Congress in Dusseldorf. This Congress took place without Pablo, who was in prison, with a big delegation from Latin America, from Posada, led by Posadas, who subsequently broke with the FI to build his own current. The Reunification Congress took place in 1963. The Reunification Congress adopted very interesting texts. They had been this had been upstream, but prepared for when other texts, the texts on the Soviet Union. Pierre Rousset will be talking about this. Also, a very important text about the dialectic of the three sectors of the world revolution, and also theses analyzing the evolution of the Soviet Union and the countries of the Eastern or Socialist Bloc. This was to lay down a common foundation for reunification. Among the main points of agreement for reunification, there was also agreement about the characterization of the leadership of the Cuban Revolution and about Algeria as well. What differentiates this is what distanced the USSWP from its comrades, the Lambert comrades in France and the Healy comrades in Britain, who actually rejected this characterization of the Cuban leadership as a revolutionary leadership. This analysis of the three sectors of the world revolution is a preparation, is a good preparation of the FI for 1968 and the events of that year, because the theses on the three sectors of the world revolution and the dialectic or interrelationship between the three sectors of the world revolution were illustrated or demonstrated in practice by what happened from 1966 onward with the big anti-war movement in the United States and in Europe as well, and in Japan, by, of course, May 1968 in France, the creeping May in Italy, the events in Czechoslovakia, the Tet offensive in Vietnam, which was a partially victorious offensive with the taking of Saigon by the Vietnamese revolutionaries, and of course the Prague Spring with comparable upheavals in Yugoslavia. And so 1968 and 1969 offered a demonstration of the dialectic of the three sectors of the world revolution. And this the fruits of this perseverance to maintain the framework of the FI were crowned with success through the recruitment, the joining of new generations of young people in a whole series of countries: France, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, Belgium, Japan, and progressively also in the following years in Spain and Portugal. And so this meant a significant growth for the FI in terms of membership numbers. I'll stop here because, of course, I have more to say. So, okay, I can continue. I've been told. We should all keep in mind that the Reunification Congress prepares the FI for the new period opened up by the events of 1968. The period opened up by 1968 also saw a rapprochement between the FI and its European leaders and processes underway in Latin America. Mandel was invited to Cuba in 1964. I'll be talking about that in tomorrow, by Che Guevara. He was invited to return in 1967. Livio Maitan crisscrosses Latin America. In Paris, he can see the proof of the interconnection of the three sectors of the World Revolution. Roberto Santuccio was part of May 68 in France and joined the JCR in Paris in 1968. There's also Petr Uhl, who subsequently founded in Czechoslovakia the Revolutionary Socialist Party in Czechoslovakia. 1968 led to the 1969 FI World Congress, which adopted armed struggle strategic line, initially with the support of the Nahuel Moreno current, which joined the FI which rejoined the FI in 1964, and also drafting of documents on armed struggle documents of the armed struggle strategy, that is saying that you should join the organization created by the Castro leadership to generalize the armed struggle strategy in Latin America. And this was represented a break with Moscow and the communist parties in Latin America to create their own way in relation to the Sino-Soviet split. And this was through the OLAS. But at the Congress itself, or during the Congress of 1969, the differences that were amplified on the armed struggle. The American U.S. SWP leadership took its distance from this position, as did the Nahuel Moreno current. Whereas at the same time, the FI recognizes Roberto Santuccio's PRT as the Argentinian section, and the Moreno's group as a sympathizing section, PRT Verdad, the Truth, or La Verdad, which then became the Argentinian PST. The armed struggle strategic orientation was the subject of intense discussions, debates. Pierre Rousset will be talking about this. He won't have time to go into all the details, but he was one of the drafters of the 1974 resolution, which involved reassessment of the armed struggle strategy. The armed struggle strategic line was subsequently critically re-examined in the following years. In the 1970s, the distance between the Nahuel Moreno current grew further. A number of difficulties arose around this armed struggle strategy, and ultimately led to the 1979 World Congress, where there was agreement between the American SWP and the European majority, leading to the dissolution of the so-called International Majority Tendency, IMT, and the so-called Leninist Trotskyist faction led by the US SWP. And I think my time is now up. I'm sure Roberto Robaina, who's taking the floor this afternoon, will have something to say about the FI and Mandel and Livio's contribution in relation to the view and roles of Nahuel Moreno, to which I've provided something of an introduction. Thank you very much for your attention. So that was Éric Toussaint from the Bureau of the FI, that he made today's opening remarks for the round table. We now have Penny Duggan, also from the FI Bureau.
So, good morning to everybody. My contribution is more limited. I'm not going to continue with the chronology of the Fourth International that Éric has started, but is to underline the importance of the memoirs Livio wrote of his time as a member of the leadership of the Fourth International, at which I had the privilege and the task of overseeing the production of the editions in English and in French. Daniel Ben Said, who wrote a preface to the memoirs, quotes Jacques Derrida, saying, "Legacies are not an asset, a form of wealth that is received and deposited in the bank. They are an active affirmation." And in holding this centenary conference, we are affirming the legacy that Ernest, Mandel, and Livio Maitan left to us in the shape of our living, breathing International. The breadth and richness of our discussions over the last 5 days, during which we held our annual meeting of the Fourth International Broad Leadership Body, bear witness to the wealth of the legacy that we have inherited and that we affirm. As Éric has outlined, Livio was one of the central leaders of the International from the post-war period through the long march of the post-war desert, the upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, the difficult period of the 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and the rise of the global justice movement through the 1990s with the Zapatista movement, with Seattle in 1999, and the early 2000s. And of course, Livio died, having been active practically up to the last minute in 2004. So these memoirs relate to his activity as a member of the leadership of this period. As Daniel Ben Said also says in his preface, Livio's Maitan contribution to a history of the Fourth International is both an eyewitness account and the transmission of a legacy. In fact, he is among the last to be able to perform this task. And indeed, we are very grateful to Livio to have chronicled his time in the leadership of the Fourth International. So here we see some photographs of Livio in the very early days in Italy. But here, for example, with the French comrades in 1969 or so, the comrades who recognize them, you will see from Livio on the left, Charles Michelot, Henri Weber, Ernest, Daniel Ben Said, and I can't put it on the right. And here we see Livio in 1974 in the divorce referendum. I'm afraid we had a great deal of trouble finding photographs of Livio to publish in the books. But so here we see Livio at work, writing indeed the memoirs. Oh, no, probably not writing the memoirs, but Livio, as he would have been. So, of the leading comrades of this period, Pierre Frank contributed a history of the Fourth International. Ernest was the subject of an important biography, and as Éric said, we regret the absence of the author of that biography and today. And there is just recently published an important and well-researched biography of Michel Rapti's Pablo, which I haven't really had the chance even to look at yet, but which is available here. So there will be the selection of books on the table at the back later. So of these comrades, therefore, only Livio has contributed both his autobiography, which chronicles in particular his life and his activity, because as Éric has underlined, he was very active in Italy and everything that the comrades did there in building the section of the Fourth International, but also these memoirs. So what he himself says about the memoirs is remember that this is a history of the activities of the international leadership of the Fourth International, and the activities of its sections are evoked only in relation to major events with global repercussions or because of their impact on the life of the International. A real history of the Fourth International, to say nothing of its national organizations, would require several years' work, not by a single person, but by a substantial research collective. I started writing this contribution very late, to be precise, on the day after my 78th birthday. So that means it was on the 2nd of April, and you can calculate from 1993. So I had to be radically selective in rereading and researching the necessary documents. These memoirs reflect Livio as he was, as a person. Livio was perpetually interested in what was really happening in the world and in the class struggle. He was thus prepared to travel endlessly, as Éric has also underlined, notably in Latin America, but also to Asia and to the very furthest corners of Europe, even to the cold and rain-swept streets of Belfast, where I accompanied him on one occasion in order to meet the comrades of Sinn Féin. And it's from this point of view that, as I was in the title of the PowerPoint, he was sometimes nicknamed the commis voyageur, the traveling salesman of the revolution. But his account of his travels you see the 3 editions of his memoirs, show not also his profound interest in the class struggle, but also in the people, in the comrades and militants that he met, how he observed sympathetically and with profound humanity their lives and the difficult conditions in which they continued nevertheless to struggle, noticing the sort of books they had on the shelves, what they were able to provide to eat, and all the small details that bring to life the way in which he visited and interacted with those that he met. There is also a sense of self-criticism and modesty. Livio's book is partisan. He doesn't pretend to hide his own political positions, but he's also prepared to express his doubts and his criticism of positions that were taken. This book is not a sectarian defense of all that the Fourth International did in that long period in which Livio was active, but he does put forward his own positions. And as Éric has mentioned, the question of the debates on armed struggle in Latin America in the late 1960s is one on which he gives his opinion, which is not agreed with by all. But as Comrade Gigi Malababa underlined in the centenary conference organized by the comrades in Rome in April of this year, the stance of the Fourth International at that point on the question of the guerrilla struggles was something that was extremely attractive and in fact drew to the Fourth International many young and radicalizing people. So we should also remember also how debates and positions were taken at the time. We could also obviously go into a discussion of today and how we pose those sorts of questions. Livio was totally committed to the cause of the revolution and the Fourth International, as has been said. He was also a cultured and erudite person. Greg Benton, who is himself a renowned academic and specialist of China and of East Asian languages, insisted on volunteering to translate these memoirs into English because, as he explained, in the late 1960s, Trotskyism was thriving in the Italian youth movement, chiefly through Livio's influence. But the Trotsky wave was met by a countering Mao wave. A debate ensued for which Livio wrote his book on China, Party, Army and Masses, published in 1969. As a young sinologist and revolutionary, it deeply influenced me and I translated it, my first book translation. From his book on China, I learned to write engaged scholarship. Gregor went further to say, this is an extract from a video he made for the presentation of Livio's book, Historical Materialism, a couple of years ago. Had he wanted, Livio could have shone as a top professor at a leading university and had a stellar academic career. Instead, apart from a spell lecturing at Rome University, he worked on a shoestring to overthrow capitalism. He also remembers, in 1998, Refoundation's Fausto Bertinotti withdrew his wrong-headed support for the Romano Prodi government. Livio exclaimed, "All my life I've been waiting to overthrow a bourgeois government. Finally I have." This last anecdote also illustrates another aspect of Livio's personality, a continual ability to be enthusiastic and to take pleasure in things. For those of us who worked with Livio, as I did for the last 20 years of his life as part of the team in the International Centre, we remember his warmth, his conviviality. He continued to play football with a team drawn from comrades in and around the LCR print shop in Paris until he was over 60. In the last few years of his life, when we came to Amsterdam for meetings, Livio preferred not to take the train, but that we should tuck him into the back of my car with a blanket and cushions for comfort. And those things are still in my car. In our World Congress in 2003, with Joanna Misnik from the United States, which shared a flat with Livio when she was in the International Presenter, we presented Livio with a cake for his 80th birthday. We knew that he valued such marks of affection from his comrades. The responsibility for the English and then the French editions of Livio's memoir was a task that I did with enthusiasm to occupy the early months of my retirement, particularly during the pandemic. Transmitting the legacy of the Fourth International is a vital task, and this was one contribution to it. The constitution of the Livio Maitan Library in Rome is another, and we should pay tribute to the comrades who had invested much work into the classification of Livio's archives. Work that is not yet finished, as there are another 15 boxes in the office in Paris that have remained there untouched for the last 20 years. There are also other archives of the Fourth International here in the Institute, in the ISG in Amsterdam, in La Contemporaine Library in Paris. We are now starting work on the last, classifying the last deposit we made there 30 years ago. We also have a project to make as much as possible available online. And we will continue to do this work, but it is our tribute to the legacy of the comrades who have gone before us, but it's also a contribution to the future generations so that they can learn and benefit from our experience. So return to Livio's memoirs, and to conclude, I will again quote from Daniel Ben Said. The manuscript is brutally interrupted in 1995 with the report on the 13th Congress of the Fourth International and with the working notes concerning the death of Ernest Mandel in that same year. This interruption and Mandel's death take on a symbolic value. It is an era and a generation that come to an end with the final chapter on the New World Order. Livio Maitan was, together with Mandel and their mentor Pierre Frank, one of the ferrymen who transmitted his legacy to us.
Donc, maintenant, comme troisième partie de l'introduction générale, c'est à Alex de Jong, qui est ici ou co-gestionnaire de IRE.
Thank you. So, as one of the co-directors of the International Institute for Research and Education in Amsterdam, of course, preserving and spreading Mandel's thought is one of our core responsibilities. Mandel's work continues to influence the work that we do in all its aspects, and maybe most of all in recent years in our educational work, in the educational courses that we organize for socialist militants from all over the world. But we also had for a very long time actually the intention, the plan to republish work by Mandel. So obviously Ernest Mandel published on a wide range of topics in a wide range of languages. But we felt it was necessary to start work on republishing some of his earlier writings, but also some of his more later work that sometimes we thought tended to be forgotten. So one of the first problems we encountered when we started the project of publishing Mandel's work was that he wrote on so many topics, from the military coup in Indonesia in 1965 to the thought of Spinoza, that it was difficult to make a selection, where to start. Of course, his major works, such as Late Capitalism and Long Ways of Capitalist Development, a book that doesn't get attention it deserves, are works that contain the main lines of his thought. But Mandel, for example, also did countless conjunctural analysis of economic developments, pieces that maybe at first glance look outdated when, for example, discussing the economic developments in China around 1980. But when taken together, these pieces present a theoretical framework. And then there are his more explicitly political books. Some of these, as well, at first glance, might look like relics from a past epoch, such as his book Revolutionary Marxism Today from 1979. So a book about revolutionary Marxism yesterday in a very different epoch. Or his critique of Eurocommunism, a current that seemed to be going extinct. But even those books retain relevance, I think, and relevant parts of analysis. For example, in his book on Eurocommunism, where Mandel criticizes the idea that the capitalist state can be gradually transformed, a critique that now has become relevant again in discussions with various new reformist currents. So, where to begin and what to do? With so many texts left in half-forgotten, edited volumes, on obscure pamphlets in different languages, left to what Marx called the gnawing critique of mice. So, one common element we thought was what Mandel in this book, another half-forgotten volume, his book-length discussion with the German radical Johannes Agnoli, described as open Marxism. In this conversation with Agnoli, Mandel modestly describes himself as a common infantry soldier of Marxism, who has taken on the task of developing an open Marxism that's always ready to take on new empirical developments and face new questions. So we thought we should center our selection on pieces that show this spirit of trying to integrate new developments and in spreading what Mandel himself called his orthodox Marxism to newer generations and broader layers. The first volume that we published is a collection focused on, but not exclusively, on pedagogical pieces, such as Mandel's famous Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory. To give an idea of the influence of this little volume, when it was published, in a Dutch translation by a left-wing publishing house as a small pamphlet and sold for the equivalent of what is now a couple of euros. Mandel didn't ask for any royalties, but because this little pamphlet sold tens of thousands of copies, it was sufficient to provide the starting capital for a new left-wing publishing house. Mandel's pedagogical skills are often praised, and I think why is clearly shown in the pieces collected in the first volume of the three books. Mandel's encyclopedia-like mind seemed to give him the ability to come up with an almost endless list of concrete examples to illustrate his theoretical points. In fact, if you wanted to make a criticism of those pedagogical pieces, it's almost that the use of examples is too much, suggesting that the explanation is a bit too watertight and a bit too complete. More complete than an open Marxism, which, as Mandel himself said, is per definition a work in progress, can possibly be. The second volume that we published collects his polemic with Chris Harman, who was one of the main thinkers of the international socialist tendency. In this discussion, or maybe polemic with Chris Harman, the center of the debate is the question on how to view the Soviet Union. Chris Harman, who unfortunately passed away in 2009, a few months after he spoke at an event in this very same room, defended the position that the Soviet economy should be seen as a form of state capitalism, while Mandel, as always, defended the orthodox position of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state. Obviously, this is an issue that today seems to have lost much of its immediate urgency. But again, just like with Mandel's conjunctural analysis of economics, there are certain theoretical points raised that remain relevant. And I think that Mandel correctly points out that even back then, Harman was exaggerating the supposed connection between seeing the Soviet Union as in some form non-capitalist and making excuses for it. Mandel certainly never made excuses for the regimes that he considered to be worker states. The third volume was difficult to give a name, and for a long time just went under its subtitle, Theoretical and Historical Essays. For this volume, we took a somewhat different approach, because the other two volumes collected pieces by Mandel that were already available in English. But half of the pieces in the third volume are translations from languages that maybe are not so widely used by non-native speakers, German and Dutch. The book was named after an essay on the philosopher Ernest that was originally published in Dutch. It seemed to me that when going through these edited volumes and these publications and trying to find things that were worth to be republished and translations and translated, that when writing in Dutch, especially, Mandel dared to venture beyond his usual terrain of economic analysis and political commentary. And he touched upon thinkers such as Ernst Bloch or Spinoza, who otherwise remained a little bit in the background if they are present at all in books like Late Capitalism. Another thing that is obvious in those writings is that Mandel in his youth had wanted to be an historian before he focused on economics. And some of the articles that have been published and that are available on the website of the IRE are historical studies, such as his essay on the Dutch Revolution against Spain, which, in Mandel's view, should be seen as an early, very early bourgeois revolution. One of the longest articles in the third volume is Mandel's essay on the so-called historian's quarrel in Germany in the 80s. So to simplify things, this historians quarrel was a debate between, on the one hand, conservative right-wing historians who argued that Nazi violence, including the death camps like Auschwitz, was a reaction to Bolshevik violence. That Nazi violence was motivated by a fear of communist revolution. On the other hand, on the other side, there were more progressive historians and thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, who insisted that the roots of Nazi violence were in German history, and that any attempt to portray this violence as a response to outside influences and factors was a way of avoiding responsibility. In his essay, Mandel is sympathetic to Habermas' position, but unlike Habermas, who thought that the roots of Nazi anti-Semitism and violence had been cut definitely and forever in Germany with the constitution of a democratic state, Mandel takes a longer view, as he always did, a more historical view, placing Nazism in the context of the capitalist counter-revolutions. For me, this was a really interesting piece to read and translate, because Mandel, whose worldview was, as well known, fundamentally optimistic, was here attempting to explain events that seemed to contradict the core of his optimistic, positive view of humanity. Mandel writes somewhere that the spark of rebellion against humiliation and degradation, oppression, exploitation, and torture is inevitable. But when writing about Auschwitz, Mandel was clearly struggling with the question if that is enough. To be honest, I think in this piece, Mandel hit the limits of what can be done when he not only tried to analyze what was at its core irrational violence through rational means, but also seemed to assume that this violence itself was rational in the sense that it served a cause outside of itself. For example, when Mandel writes that Nazi rhetoric about so-called Jewish Bolshevism by no means corresponded to an inner conviction or even personal fear among Hitler and his cronies. In Mandel's words, this Nazi anti-Semitism was pure demagogy aimed at gaining power, just as in the case of the pseudo-socialist demagogy. This might explain part of the use of this rhetoric by the Nazis, but it doesn't really explain why Nazi anti-Semitism became a goal in itself. Another thing that struck me when trying to collect more unknown pieces by Mandel was that it's clear that, especially at the end of his life, he kept returning to the question of Nazism, fascism, and the war. Throughout his life, it remained a moral touchstone for him. The question, what would you have done? Mandel's fundamental rational approach, even to such irrational matters, doesn't mean that he was not aware of how fundamentally irrational capitalism is. In the same volume, the third volume, is one of my favorite articles, I would say. And it's an early example of Marxist ecology, called the dialectic of growth. Mandel here develops an early critique of how capitalism treats natural resources as endless and thereby as disposable and free. Mandel writes, profit is a criterion of economic rationality, entirely determined by the social nature of the relations of productions. Profit quantifies in monetary terms only that which has a price, and it leaves everything aside which has no price. This means that profit is the goal, regardless of the effect on society as a whole, and it is certainly not the expression of a comprehensive long-term objective. That which increases the direct profits of a corporation may reduce the income of society as a whole. That which increases the direct profits may reduce resources available to society and destroy people's health and lives. These two elements cannot be valued in terms of money without changing human life from an end to a means to increase profits. So while talking about ecology, Mandel was here showing what was for him the most fundamental value, that of human life and human dignity. Especially later in his life, Mandel repeatedly quoted a statement by Trotsky that even if all the predictions and all the principles of Marxism would be proven wrong, which is something that Mandel did not think would ever happen, but even if this would happen, Mandel said, the tasks for socialists would remain the same. The task would remain to be at the side of the oppressed and to fight along with them for a better world. Mandel wrote, the capitalist market economy, meaning a generalized market economy, produces an increasing contradiction between the economic rationality of its parts and the social economic irrationality of the whole. This was written decades ago, but I think that today, with capitalism unwilling and unable to even mitigate, let alone stop the climate crisis, those are very relevant words. To conclude, I think we can all agree with Mandel when he wrote that the way out of this crisis and this increasing irrationality of capitalism is a growing self-activity, a growing rebellion, a growing ability of people to take their fate into their own hands, to have more equality and solidarity without borders. We hope that these books and our other publications can help fan some sparks of that rebellion.